Honestly, though, okay, I'll tell you, this is exposing a flaw in the sermon, because the first point really isn't it's reasonable to believe the Bible. The first point is the setup to the second point, the logical one. That's the answer. Okay, it's you're either a good person, bad person, or crazy person. That's it. That's how you explain the Bible came from God, because who else could have written it? The reasonable part, all that does is it shows me that there has to be an answer, right? Are we recording? Because this is good stuff. Okay, yeah, we're recording right now.
Oh, we are? Okay.
Yeah, so there has to be an answer. That's the only thing that makes sense. That's the reasonable part of the sermon, because I don't find it comfort. I don't find any sense of understanding, and it just doesn't make any sense that God would make all of this and then not tell me who He is. Right? It doesn't make any sense. It's not reasonable. That's not reasonable that God would create me, give me, as all people have, the desire to know, who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? To have those questions built into the human part of the mind and not provide me with those answers. That's not reasonable.
No. And really, what's so reasonable about that is that God, when He does communicate to us, it's not going to be something that's hard to understand or that is in some kind of mystic code or anything like that.
Right.
Very, very reasonable communication in a way that His creation can understand it. Why? Because He took part of His creation, inspired them to write it. And so they used their personalities, their experiences, their situations, their languages to be able to communicate what God is telling them to communicate to the rest of mankind.
And that's really the big difference between the Bible and all these other books that claim what the Bible also claims, which is, well, we're the book that it gives all the answers. But they all came from like one guy or one group of people who all were at the same time. Like the Bible is spread over like a millennia, right? With all these different people from all these different parts of the world. But they're all saying the same thing, though some of them writing at the exact same time as each other, saying the same thing when they didn't even know each other.
Right.
Things like that just lead you to a conclusion that, okay, God made me, God wants to talk to me, and it seems like it's reasonable to think the Bible is the way He talks to me.
And what's really reasonable is that there is one source to the one story.
Right. 40 writers, but the one God who inspired them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the setup to the last part of the sermon, which is it is logical to conclude that the Spirit is in the Bible, the truth. That the truth that you said last week, I need to have the right attitude toward accepting.
Yeah.
That I can trust the Bible is that truth because the Spirit is in that truth and in no other truth.
Right.
Because the Bible's the only one that logically answers the question of who I am, where I came from, and all that.
Yeah.
And so the way we're going to explain that in the sermon is by saying there's only three kinds of people.
Yeah.
You're either a good person, a bad person, or a crazy person.
Yeah.
So who wrote the Bible?
Yeah. You know, people in the world today, they talk about how science is logical. Well, really, if you think about where science came from and who is the inventor of science, well, the reason that science is logical is because God is logical, and therefore His Word is logical. So
Right.
it all makes sense. If you're looking for logic, you don't have to go very far to be able to find it. It's right there in the Scriptures.
Yeah, it's a very bad misconception about the Bible that it is, like you say, this weird mystical thing that doesn't make sense. Now, there are parts of it that are hard to explain because they're supernatural, right? But any sufficiently powerful being is indistinguishable from magic, right? As the old saying goes. So it seems mystical to me because I can't fathom it, but it's still within the context of the Bible is explained. The God who made nature can supersede nature.
Yeah.
If I make this paper, I can also crumble it up because I am bigger than it.
Yes.
God can make it rain in a building.
Yeah.
Because He made the rain and the building.
Yeah.
Or the things that the building's made of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, science says there is a logical explanation for everything, but it's so funny how the scientist refuses to concede the possibility that God is the maker of everything.
Yeah.
And when they discount God, they just spin a circle trying to find an answer they'll never find because they've already discounted the one answer that's true.
You know, what's also interesting about this is that the Hebrew author writes and says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So there's a lot of times we think, well, we've got to logically be able to explain God. Well, we don't really, because really what God is expecting of us is not a logical problem-solving people. He's actually expecting of us to be a faithful people that understand who He is and can believe it without having all the evidence in front of us to be able to see it.
Yeah.
That's what faith really is.
But still, though, if you want to dig under the surface, you can find the evidence there. You don't need the evidence, but hey, Thomas wanted the evidence.
Yeah.
Jesus provided the evidence. Right? That's what happened in John 20. So Thomas said, unless I see it, I won't believe. Well, that's sad, but Jesus didn't call him a bad person. Right. He just said, here's what the disciples saw when you weren't in the building last time. Here's my hands and feet. Yeah. So, yeah, you don't need to have the evidence. But when you choose to dig under the surface, it's there. So that's the point you make to someone who brings up, when you tell them the truth and they say, well, how do I know what that is the truth? How do I know? Yeah. If they don't want to have faith, then you have to go under that surface and say, well, here's how we do know. Yeah. Because who else wrote it? Yeah. And that goes back to what I was saying a second ago. There's only three kinds of people who, if it wasn't God, could have written the Bible. Yeah. Who was Peter or Paul or David or Moses? They were either a good person or bad person, or he was a crazy person. Yeah. So you say, well, he was a good person? That's what people say. They were good people. Well, they said they were inspired, though. So that means they're liars and not good people. Well, then they must be bad people. They were bad people who wrote the Bible. But they condemn themselves sometimes, and they condemn each other. If it's a big conspiracy, that doesn't make any sense. That's not reasonable. No. Right? And then they must be crazy people. Okay, come on. 40 crazy people over the course of 1,000 years wrote a book that makes perfect sense in harmony. Right. No. One crazy person can write some beautiful poetry that you think, how did this one person do that? Fine. Okay. Crazy people can do amazing things. But 40 different crazy people, some of whom never met each other, most of whom never met each other, aren't going to write one perfectly harmonious book. Right. That's a fairy tale. That's the fantasy. Yeah. And I don't believe that. So if they're not good, bad, or crazy,
they have to be inspired.
They have to be inspired. That's
the one source that is providing all the reasonable, logical information to them. Right. Which would be God, the Spirit.
So the Sermon Sunday basically is, it's reasonable to think that God, who made us, would want to communicate with us. It's logical to think that communication is the Bible, because the Spirit is confirmed to be in this book, the truth. Yeah. That's the sermon.
Wonderful. It's convicting.
Yeah, I can't wait.
And reassuring. Yeah. And encouraging.
So, to tie it in, to bring it all home with your sermon and mine together, once that's understood, let's go back to the question from last week. What are you going to do with that truth? Yeah. You going to accept it or reject it? Because you can't argue it's not truth, because the Spirit's in this message.